Hello and welcome back to OT Podcast, first episode of 2023. We're here talking about Watches Time and all that stuff. My name's Felix.
And I'm Andy. Felix, you forgot the name of the show for a second, or forgot the year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in the post-holiday fugue. Is this OT the podcast? Is this, Christmas presents, the unwrapping?
Where am I? What year is it? 2024? 23?
Exactly. It's been a wild couple of weeks at Shay Schultz. How have you been, Andy?
Very good, Felix. I'm excited. We finally got someone on that we've probably been talking about getting on since the start of the show.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this, just before. If we sort of rack up mentions of who is, the most frequently referenced people on our podcast, there's three in no particular order. It's Frank Mueller, it's Chris Hall, and it's today's guest, Victoria Gomelsky.
From just about everywhere.
Yeah, just about everywhere. JCK, Trade Press, we talk about jewellery trade press. We talk about her work for the New York Times, which you've probably read. We will chat to her in a second. Before that, Andy, most important question I'm going to ask you all year. How was Christmas?
How's my Christmas?
Yeah.
Long, blown out. It was I reckon it was like an 11-day window that just was too much.
My immediate follow-up, and this is one I've put very little thought into before writing down on this note. Do you have any watch-related New Year's resolutions?
I've been thinking about this a little bit lately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, getting a little bit spiritual after the whole Mark Cho, interview last year where he offloaded all of his watches for the greater good. I don't think I'm gonna offload, but I am gonna stop buying watches this year. I don't want to buy a watch this year unless it's really special.
This is not to downgrade your sentiment. This is such a January.
I'm
gonna
it's gym on Jan 1.
Yeah. I'm gonna wait until Rolex and Tudor releases 2023 drop. I'm gonna ask you that question. Then we're gonna edit.
Yeah, give me 3 months, and I'm sure the tune will change.
I'm gonna buy the Tudor Black Bay Pro something. Then we can play this little soundbite damning of you saying. But no, I understand what you're saying.
I want to get into like a different hobby a little bit more. So I've been doing. I think I told you, but I've been doing a lot of car detailing over my Christmas break because I've had a bit of time off. We've obviously not done the podcast. I've had a bit of a break from other stuff.
Been getting into sponges.
Well, every other day I'm down like buying more detailing gear. I think I spent like $800 or $900. It's out of control. But I feel like this is what people with normal hobbies that don't cost thousands of dollars just to like every time you do it. I feel like this is what they do. It just creeps up, and you end up spending a lot of money on a hobby.
Yeah, I also think so. I think you need to take some. This is part of your personality as well. You go pretty hard into things.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing where there's a setup cost, right? Like you got to get the high pressure, you got to get foaming cannons. You get this like once you have it,
Asher and stuff.
Yeah, you get the Kasha, you get the attachments. I got a big. You'll like this. It's a big boy mini blower, and it's a dryer for a car.
Wow, I feel attacked and seen with that statement.
It's pretty cool. It's an Australian invention, but it's basically a big hairdryer for drying your car, so you don't have to use a towel, and it just you cook it all. Side note, it's got a temperature setting which is appropriate for dogs. So my long-haired Samoyed,
the big boy mini blower,
gets hit with the big boy. Tried him after a little pool session, and it worked quite well. But once you get the setup costs out of the way, then you're just talking about consumables, which is microfiber towels and soap, and that stuff's it lasts a little while, so it's not too bad. It's just the setup. So but it's the sort of thing where you get into the hobby and like, oh, I need to go get this. I need an interior cleaner. I need a leather cleaner. I need a leather conditioner. Oh, I need window cleaner. Oh, I need microfibers for my windows. Like it doesn't end.
You're using the word need a lot there, but I love it.
Right, and then you start watching 20-minute videos on how to wash microfiber cloths properly or clean windows properly. But that has me thinking. I want to get into another hobby a little bit more that's not watches.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't want to buy a watch. I'll buy a coffee machine this year. I want to get like a really good coffee machine set up for espresso.
I mean, fair enough. I mean, you've got to grow as people. Related question: do we have any podcast resolutions this year? This may be more of a, maybe we should take this offline into the strategic business development chat. But or we could just do it now.
Oh, Felix, I think we need to do some video content of some sort.
We should do some video. More events,
Really
more
interesting.
video.
Or watch content.
But you know what's not going to change, Andy?
What's that?
Artem straps. Actually, no, that's a lie. They will change frequently because they're so easy to change. Did you like that segue? How
Those
smooth?
quick release spring bars built into the strap.
I recently changed the strap. It's been hot here
Yes.
in Melbourne recently, and so the Grand Seiko typically for me is on the metal bracelet. I wasn't feeling it. It was too pinchy. It was my wrist was expanding. It wasn't comfortable. So I used those exceptional drilled lugs, popped it on a black Artem NATO,
Uh-huh.
the classiest of the NATOs, and I was just wearing it around. It's actually the first watch I've worn this year that wasn't smart, and I got a surprise compliment from my partner who barely
Never
rests.
compliments you on anything.
No, never watches. It's like, "You strap? That looks very nice, very sharp." So there you go, as endorsed
Wow.
by, the loved ones votee, Artem Straps, artemstraps.com, artem.straps on Instagram. You cannot ask for a higher endorsement of the significant other of a watch industry
Mm.
professional that doesn't care about watches. If they notice it, you know it's good.
What do they say? The chicks dig it. Might be
That's
the new
one way of putting
catchphrase.
it. What have you been digging, Andy? Anything?
Yeah, I'm getting through the old backlog as well. So time off's great. I've been getting through a bit of a backlog on things I wanted to watch, and one of them was Welcome to Wrexham. I can't remember who, but someone recommended Ted Lasso probably last year or the year before.
Oh,
Not sure, not sure who that was that suggested it. Might have been you.
mm.
And then, so Welcome to Wrexham is kind of semi the real life version of
Ted
what
Lasso IRL. That's the
kinda
top one.
kinda. So it's Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. So everyone
Oh,
knows who,
Sunny in Philadelphia, dude.
Deadpool and the guy from Sunny, or Mythic Quest if you're into Apple TV, where you can also find Ted Lasso. What happened was, I think in like 2020 or 2019, Rob found out about this football club through one of his British writers on Always Sunny, and kind of it was in this peculiar position where it was really low ranked. And I don't really know that much about the football system in the UK, but it was like fourth kind of
Yeah, it was in
tier,
4th division or whatever, or
fourth tier, right? And it's like the third oldest football club in the world. The stadium's been around since, or the club's been around since like 1500.
wow.
So it was very like historically significant, but it was really underperforming. Like, it was just trash.
Sure,
The players were getting paid like on average £50,000 a year, and like living in share housing. So 4 or 5 players would be in this really crappy share housing. They all had like other jobs, didn't
sure.
really make any money. Then the pandemic hit, so they weren't really pulling any money through the doors because they couldn't have spectators.
Yeah,
So he came up with this crazy idea, I guess, to buy the club.
sure,
And he'd never met Ryan Reynolds. They'd met online, but they never met sort of in person. So somehow they formed this bromance and ended up kind of investing or buying the team together, and decided to make a documentary out of it, which is incredibly smart. And it documents everything from, coming in, the existing management team, which is what they call coaches, the management, the actual management from the business side of things, the players, and sort of navigating the transition from really underperforming and being these underdogs to try and sort of investing enough money to bring them up and try and break out of that division into the next one. And the division they're in is like the hardest to get out because there's 24 teams and
sure.
only one automatically leaves.
And you've got to, like, I'm assuming you just got to spend money and get good to
Well, it's not that simple because it's so competitive, and there's a weird point system where if you win, you get 3 points. If you draw, each team gets 1 point, and if you lose, you don't get a point. So you don't want to. You definitely don't want to lose,
you
but
want to draw.
drawing can be good, but you really want to be winning. And if you don't have a good start, then
That's not that weird in a competitive sports league.
well, it's just the ranking. So you want, sometimes it's good. Well, no, sometimes a draw is good. Sometimes it's really bad.
Yeah, and depending who you're playing, a win might not be the
Yeah. And so the town of Wrexham is really, really small and like really loyal. It's really important. It's like culturally significant. And the fascinating thing about the whole documentary is it's not really about Ryan and Rob as
sure.
much as it is about the people impacted by the team. So they document everything from, local supporters, and, one of them talking about how he takes kids, and his dad took him and his grandpa took him. And, it's a generational thing. They talk about the players who are, really, really underpaid. And for a professional athlete, there's guys in the top, Division 1 getting paid a couple $1,000,000 a game or whatever,
Mm-mm.
or probably not that much, a couple $100,000 a game, and then these guys getting paid, a couple of grand a game, and there's a lot of games a week, but it's not very good money. They talk about the volunteers and some of the disability workers that are sort of helping out and sort of pulling them into full time.
Yeah, nice.
The local economy. There's some really interesting stuff about the local sponsors and how they transition out from there's, I think it's like a trailer company. So they do, Ryan Reynolds and Rob do this ad for a trailer company to support their sponsor before eventually getting Expedia and TikTok on board to
That's incredible.
yeah. So it's sort of
Ryan Reynolds is going to do your ad if
well,
you're
yeah,
like
it's got aviation.
Mike's Trailer World.
It's like I4 trailers or something because it's Welsh.
Yeah,
And yeah, they're doing this ridiculous ad for this trailer company you've never heard of. So it's part of it is that sort of the charm of that.
sure.
They really only come in for the decision making stuff of like, oh, we need to replace the pitch. What does it cost? Oh, we want to get this guy, and the stress of the top level stuff. But for the most part, it's not.
It's not about them.
It's not about them, which I think is quite beautiful. So I reckon everyone should check it out. Welcome to Wrexham
Quick
on,
question.
I guess, Disney Plus.
Does the final episode end with them winning the World Cup?
I'm not there yet. I think I'm 5 episodes in.
Okay. I assume it does.
No, I don't know that it will end. I mean, I think football fans will know where it ends up, but it's very wholesome. It's sort of a couple of guys with a lot of money and one guy with a heap of money
Mm.
doing something really wholesome in a really smart way that's economical for him because obviously,
Yeah, it makes money off it.
Ryan's businesses get plugged, they get sponsors in.
Yep.
They've made a documentary which they make money from, so it's an investment, but it
Great
still
PR.
feels really wholesome. It doesn't feel like a stupid
Exploitative.
cash grab.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, check it out.
Andy, anything else happening in the world of Mr. Green, or shall
Oh,
we move on to Victoria G?
I should say I sent you a picture. I did spot I think it was a Jacques Dro
Yeah, it was.
on Rob McElhenney's wrist.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
a couple
That's
I
where that
thought
was
it
from.
was. Yeah,
Oh,
which is an odd choice for him, maybe. Maybe he's got a relationship there. I don't know.
I mean, Jacques O'Dro. Get on it, Jacques O'Dro executives who I assume watch to this. If you don't have Rob on board,
Yeah, get
you
him.
probably got it in a gift bag at like the Oscars or something.
Anything else, or should we get onto old mate?
Look, I mean, I've been, dealing with the ups and downs of everyday life with no air conditioning, but that is not something anyone wants to hear about. I think we need to hear about what's going on in the world of Victoria Gomelsky.
Let's do it.
If you're a long-term listener to the podcast, you'll have heard us recommend stories from today's guest many times. So the time has come to have her on. The lovely Victoria Gomelsky is editor-in-chief of JCK, a New York-based trade jewellery publication. She also writes for the New York Times, Robb Report, The Hollywood Reporter, and so many more places. Welcome to OT, Victoria. How are you?
Thank you so much, Felix. I'm great. It's so nice to be on. I'm really honored that you guys have asked me.
It's about time. As Felix said, probably once a month we bring up one of your articles, Victoria.
Aw, I love that.
Big fans. We are big fans.
That's really
But pretty
cool.
much maybe every time you write one, we just sort of, we get the alert and we put it on. Hey, I've got an opening question. When your website, which we did some extensive and very serious research on before we got you on, says that you love travel. Have you made it to Australia?
I have actually a couple times, and it's been a while, but back in the 90s, so this is dating me, but
Sure.
I backpacked and I think I met a lot of great Australians along the way. But my one of
Uh-huh.
my first big backpacking trips, I started out in Fiji of all places, and then ended up in New Zealand, and then ended up in Australia because I had a friend in Sydney, and we rented, and then a couple other friends joined me, so we rented a beater, like a Ford station wagon, the kind they don't make in the States. I don't remember what
Hmm.
the model was, and we drove up to the Whitsundays
Oh, lovely.
and, yeah, learned how to scuba dive and spent a little time there and then drove all the way back. So but we went, past all those key spots like Byron Bay and Noosa, and had another friend in Surfers Paradise, and, that was wonderful. So that was a great we missed Melbourne, sadly, so that is my next big spot in Australia. But then I came back a few years later to go to a pearl farm in the Northern Territories,
Uh-huh.
and I flew into Darwin. So I actually flew from LA to, or no, I think it was actually New York to Bangkok via Brunei to
Hmm.
Darwin, and, just spent, like, a less than a week there, but, it was fascinating. It was a Paspali pearl farm. I'm
Yep.
guessing you know
Yep.
Paspali.
Yes. Work trip. So this was a work trip.
Yeah, so that was my first big trip when I started writing about jewelry and watches in 2000. The backpacking trip was just me and my girlfriends, just and then we carried on to Southeast Asia after that. So that was my first introduction in '97 to Australia, and then I came back in 2000 to go to the pearl farm in, Port Bremer, if you know where
Oh
that
yeah,
is.
yeah. Those pearl farms are fascinating, right? Because it's I mean it's like gold. It's so valuable that they have a fun time
It
managing theft and a lot of fly-in workers to kind of do it all.
Yeah, I mean, these guys all lived on this pearl farm, and I think it was their northernmost farm in the Paspali network. And there's crocodiles around. There's like bentang cattle. I mean, it was a real, it's just not the kind of place as a tourist you'd go. So it was a fascinating look at how these beautiful, very, very expensive pearls are cultured and brought to market. But it was great, and I loved Darwin. I loved how I mean, I loved the food. It just felt like it was closer to, Papua New Guinea than in some ways Sydney, maybe. I'm not sure if that's actually true,
Yeah,
but
no, it really is.
It's kind of accurate, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I don't know about you, Felix, but I have a lot of. I mean, I always hear crazy pearl farm stories of people that worked on them. They're always pretty wild.
Yeah, no, I don't have that many pearl farming mates, I'll be honest. But we do. I mean, it's funny. I mean, we talk about jewelry. Australia's got, quite. I often don't think about Australia and jewelry, but we have, the famous pink diamonds in the
Hmm.
past, and
Opals.
opals. Cass
Opals.
Paisley's a giant producer, obviously. So
Yeah, you
lots
got
of mineral resources.
sapphires too, actually. I was just writing about Australian sapphires this morning, if you could believe it. So yeah, you
Wow.
guys are rich.
Sounds like the netball team or something. Um, well, you're sort of leading into this, but you've been writing professionally about watches and jewelry for over 20 years now, which is quite some time. And not to make a pun, but journalism, especially watch journalism, can be a bit of a minefield these days when it comes to quality. Felix mentioned New York Times, Robb Report, Hollywood Reporter, all these really big kind of prestigious titles. Obviously JCK as well. What sort of standard do you uphold when you are writing? Because one of the reasons we bring it up so much is because of the quality that you put out and the sort of the integrity that comes with it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a great question. I think really I think it's easy to phone stuff in, especially with
Mm,
the amount of copy that websites demand, and you want your daily hits. So I think a lot of people, you can phone it in. You can just rewrite a press release and there you go, you've got it. Or you can take quotes that have been sort of prepared and sent to you and sent to everybody else for that matter and use those. But I try to speak to people as much as possible. And with the Swiss, a lot of them want to do stuff over email, and I will accept an email interview if I have to, but I try my very best to actually get people on the phone because I find that the quotes are just that much better. They're that much more candid. Otherwise, you end up sounding like people in their quotes sound like press releases.
mm,
They've been vetted by how many people in the PR team. They just sound more like something that this chat GPT might have spun out versus a real person actually saying something of value and of interest. So I think that's probably it begins with that is just talking to people and talking to a lot of people. I mean, for an average New York Times story, a minimum number of interviews I have is 10. And
Oh,
if you think about, I try to speak to, sometimes those conversations last an hour each. So that's just in the research. I'm spending possibly 10 hours of just interviews. I mean, it's not, I probably should be better about that because I don't often, you could spend an hour talking to somebody and you maybe get one sentence of quotable material. So that's not a very efficient use of my time or theirs for that matter. It's just that some people are talkers. I know you guys know that, so I just sort of try to absorb, I guess, is what I'm
I mean,
saying.
and that knowledge, I don't think it ever hurts, and it always comes back around. Like that one chat you had with the, I don't know, the ceramics designer at this place will come in handy down the line in 6 months' time when you randomly write an article on, I don't know, the ceramic shortage of 2023.
Right. Right. I mean, luckily, it's easy to search my notes too. So yeah, if I've spoken to somebody for an hour, I get one usable quote for the story on my plate at that moment. But who knows? You're right. And then maybe six
Yeah,
months later, I'll remember that, and I can just go into everything's just stored in my trusty old laptop. So yeah, I
incredible.
do have a ton of material that I draw from.
On a similar note, I'm interested to ask about your role at JCK, and I find that fascinating because not only is it a print magazine, which is I believe it's still print. I could
Yep,
be wrong.
yep, yep. It is.
An increasing rarity these days. It's also a trade title that still exists in print, which uh, blows my mind living in Australia. Honestly, I don't think we don't have GQ in print anymore down here.
Wow.
So, what has that title taught you? It's also incredibly long running in terms of like institutional knowledge, or that sort of more specialist focus. Like, what do you take from there and apply elsewhere, or you know?
Right. Well, thank you for giving me a moment to just shine the light on trade publications. It's it's they're not the glamorous titles that I think as a young aspiring writer you might think of. People want to work for GQ or write for Vogue or the New York Times, but
Mm,
it is the trade where you get down into the trenches and you learn. You have these conversations with people who are maybe not the CEOs of Patek Philippe, or because Patek Philippe doesn't have any need for trade publications. They don't advertise in those magazines. They don't need them. But you do talk to dealers who are dealing with the business of the business. And
yes.
so you just get, and I learned that very early. My first job, well, actually, my very first job in jewelry and watch writing was for a trade website, and then that website went bust shortly thereafter, and I got hired at a competing magazine to JCK called National Jeweler, and I learned very very soon after that this was how I was going to learn the ins and outs of the business, and that's what gave me the foundation to write confidently for the Times, which came along a few years later. I've been editor of JCK since 2010, but the magazine itself goes way, way back to 1869. It was actually originally a watchmaking publication, so it wasn't
Huh.
always called JCK. I think it was called the Horological Journal. And it sprung up in Lower Manhattan when the business of watches and jewelry sprung up. It really parallels the history of that the industry in the United States. And there was gold. It's right near Wall Street, actually, down in Lower Manhattan. There's Gold Street, there's Pearl Street. All these streets where the earliest merchants of the business found themselves in. They needed ways to reach clients and ways to advertise what they were offering, and so that's where the magazine stepped in. And JCK then ended up uh, becoming kind of the standout, or the survivor of all these various mergers and acquisitions in the trades that happened over the course of 60, 70 years. Eventually, in the 1930s, it was a magazine called Jeweler's Circular. And if you can think about what a circular is, it's like an old
Sure.
timey word for a newsletter, merged with another magazine called Keystone. They became Jeweler's Circular Keystone. And then I think in the 90s, it took that long to finally just shorten it to JCK. And I've been their editor since 2010, and I am still their editor. The print business sadly has diminished. I mean, it was 10 print issues a year when I joined, then it went down to 7, then it went down to 4, and now it's 1 print issue a year, which we went down to during the pandemic. So we're hanging on, but that print issue is a really beautiful issue. And even though it doesn't have the, like I said, the sort of glamour or the appeal of a Vogue or a GQ or any of these fancy titles that most people see on the newsstands, it is every bit as influential in the jewelry industry, among and watch industry among people who know, because it's often the very first place where some news will break, because we're in there, we're in the trenches with the people who are doing the business. It's a magazine geared towards retailers, but
Hmm.
anybody in the industry can read it. So I think it just does trades don't get enough attention, but they're often where news will break and then go out to the wider world.
I find that interesting. So you're talking about the retailers, and they are such an important part of the industry, and we have seen a lot of shift away from multi-brand retailers in Australia at least, and where the brands are sort of getting more involved, especially over the last 10 years. But one thing that I always chuckle at is every time any brand you talk to, how's this model sell? Oh yeah, really well, really well. And then, oh, how many you're selling? And then it's like a dozen or something. But every brand, and Felix, you'll probably agree with me, but every brand we talk to, everything's always amazing. Every model always sells really well. It's always super positive. And then when you talk to the retailers, it's usually a different story. And, there's probably a bit of negativity in there. But I also think they're the extra ones, selling a lot of the products and speak a little bit more of the truth. Is that something you've found with sort of the trenches, as you call them?
Yeah, I mean, I think because the brands themselves, they're talking about sell in, I guess, sell into the
Yeah, not
market
sell
versus
through.
sell through, and
But
it's
it's
the
in their interest
retailers.
as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely, retailers can be funny because it depends. I mean, you can either, and especially if you're dealing with a Rolex or like an authorized dealer, a lot of
Mm,
those retailers are way more careful and less candid than you would hope. They just need to keep up an image. They don't want to upset their the crown. They don't want to upset any of the brands that they have big relationships with or big partnerships with. So it depends, but yeah, on the whole, I mean, if you have a good relationship with the retailer and they'll
Meet them at the
they're
Christmas party, have a few
yeah,
drinks.
yes, that I mean, I think they're the ones who are dealing again, back to that word, the trenches, they're in there. They know exactly what customers are coming in and complaining about. They see the best side of this business, the worst side of this business, and they often, will know much more than they'll let on. So as
mm.
long as you have a good relationship with them, um, that's who really understands what's happening, especially those that have quite a few brands in their mix and have relationships with Switzerland because they'll it's nice to see them in like Geneva at Watches and Wonders or one
Yeah.
of the because that's where you'll kind of hear some of the not necessarily dirt, but sometimes it's dirt.
The goss. Yeah. So, you mentioned the pandemic. Obviously, watches and watch brands as a whole had a really strong sort of 2021, even 2022. Watch brands had a great year. Why is everyone so nervous now?
I'm doing a big piece on the pre-owned markets running
Hmm.
mid-Jan or like sort of later Jan, and I clearly you're seeing all these hype watches, quote unquote hype watches, the
Mm,
ones that shot up to 4 times retail value coming back down. And it really depends on who you talk to. I think if you talk to people who have a vested interest in that category, whether they're secondhand dealers like a Bob's Watches or a Watchbox, or they're authorized dealers, a lot of them are putting a good spin on things. They're saying, listen, yes, prices are coming down, but they're still, coming down to well above retail. So if the Daytona was trading at its peak at 4 times retail value, it's now at 2 times retail value. And that's a very good thing for the market. It doesn't help the market when speculative pricing sets in and you get a lot of um, sort of people who are just buying to make a fast buck. So a lot of people are trying to put a good spin on it. Nobody is really that I've spoken to seems particularly gloomy about 23, but everybody does seem pretty sure that the growth we've seen over the last couple of years is bound to come to an end. So if it was say 20% growth or more, it might be more on the order of 4 or 5% growth in 23,
Mm.
which for a mature or a maturing business is not bad at all. But I think it's just compared to the phenomenal growth we saw during the pandemic and leading into the pandemic, because even though the pandemic clearly, as someone put it to me this morning, sort of put a rocket booster on the business. Uh, the fundamentals that are responsible for what we're seeing now in the marketplace, I mean, they came into play at least 5 years ago, 2017, 20, even 2016, 2018, right around there, we saw the seeds of the marketplace we see now. Um, and that's it's interesting to look back and even further if you look back to the early 2000s and eBay and the internet and of course the very beginnings of the pre-owned marketplace, go back that far. So there's, it's an interesting business. There's a lot at work and there's a lot of money, but there's also a lot of focus on these hype models that went up and are now coming back down. But the rest of the market is probably a little more average than all those hype stories would suggest.
One of the most interesting stories I find in recent years about sort of the secondary market, and I'd really be, maybe it's a sneak peek or, just your thoughts on this in general, is the fact that Watchbox either bought outright or has a controlling stake in Debatoon, which I think is such an interesting dynamic shift. I mean, we've seen sort of watch retailers have controlling stakes in brands before. I'm thinking sort of the Hourglass and Bulgari or Daniel Roth, I think it was in the
Hmm.
mid 2000s. Is this a new thing? Like, what's your take on that situation?
Gosh, that's a good question. It's very funny that you point that out because literally the conversation I had this morning was with Danny Govberg, who of
Uh-huh.
course
Sure.
is spun off his pre-owned business into Watchbox in 2017, and Debathune came up and oh gosh, we saw over the course of the last 5 or 6 years retailers become media,
Yep.
or media become retailers in the case of
Yes.
Hodinkee. So we saw those channels kind of open up. Do we see retailers becoming owners of brands? I don't know that I've thought about that, but that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think in these smaller niche independent brands that need backing and obviously have such desirable timepieces and such scarcity, there's a pretty good business model in there when you have a global community of watch collectors who over the last couple of years have had nothing to do but spend time thinking about their favorite independent watchmakers. I mean, even as the rest of the market cools and maybe some of the volume brands feel a little bit of the come down, I think those independent niche small batch makers, the Groenfelds and the Debethunes and clearly the FP Journes, I don't think they have anything to worry about. So it's a great business.
And what about the sort of blurred lines we're seeing between watch media, watch brands, watch retailing?
I mean, I guess I remember talking to Max Booster about this
Mm.
4 or 5 years ago, maybe before Hodinkee became a retailer. And yeah, it has been interesting, but clearly, if you have content and you have sway, then why not take advantage of that and actually, I mean, create a marketplace, but of course it poses challenges to your sort of sense of independence and or conflict of interest. So I'm not saying it's an easy road to walk to be a retailer and a media company and you know a, a brand all at the same time, but people certainly are trying.
As I saw you were at an event for Jacob and Co. Well, it was probably a month ago. What's going on with that brand?
Oh my god, that event. I think that was I've talked about it every step of the way. Do you guys have White Lotus down there?
Yep.
Yes.
Have you
That
are you watching the second season?
I've just finished. That was what blows my mind. Why were they not advertising this as watch brand in White Lotus Hotel?
Well,
That would have been.
it was actually the other Grand Hotel. Well, at
Oh,
least
was
I think
it?
some people, I believe, did stay at this
Uh,
on this press trip to Taormina in Sicily. So it was in late October, right before Halloween, and we got the invite. Gosh, I might have gotten the invite in September or something, and it was like 36 hours in Sicily from Los
yeah.
Angeles, which a lot of people think is insane. Why would
Mhm.
you do that? But I think it would be insane to say no, I
Sure.
mean, it was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Godfather film, and the idea was the idea was, of course, that they were presenting a watch there, and the watch is just beyond nuts. It's like one of the nuttiest watches I've ever seen. It has, first of all, it's $500,000, okay, or Swiss francs. It's got like scenes from The Godfather engraved all around the case. It's a musical watch, so it plays the theme of The Godfather. It's just beyond bonkers. And they were unveiling it there and had a big party, invited tons of press and
Mm.
collectors, mind you. So it wasn't just press, but there were serious collectors there. One of whom I've never heard of a collection like his. He's a Singaporean guy who I don't even know how many watches he has. I'd have to look back in my notes, but they're all crazy. Not as crazy as the Godfather watch. Some of them are, sort of more traditional crazy watches.
Mm.
But anyway, so they had all these people there, and it was their first big, big press trip. And I sat and talked with Benjamin, who is Jacob's son, who's sort of taken over the business. And they've always loved The Godfather. I guess Jacob, when he emigrated to the States from Uzbekistan in the late 70s, it's one of the first films he saw. I can relate because my family, we emigrated from the Soviet Union in the late 70s, and my father learned English reading The Godfather in Leningrad at the time, now St.
Huh.
Petersburg. And so it was one of my dad's favorite films, and he passed earlier this year. So when I got the invite, I was like, oh, hell yeah. Hell yeah, I'm going to this. And it was a really, actually quite beautiful trip. They put us up at the Grand Hotel Tomeo, which is a Belmont property. It's the other Grand
Mm.
Hotel in town. So where the White Lotus is set is the San
Four
Domenico
Seasons? Or,
Palace. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a Four Seasons property. I think some people actually did stay there. I didn't stumble on it, or I didn't walk over there, but I did walk through town. So every time I watch, the season two, I I'm just taken back there. It's such a beautiful place, and we got to see we went to all the spots that The Godfather was filmed. So the
Sure.
place where Apollonia is blown up in the car. We had a big fancy dinner there. I mean, it couldn't have been more decadent. It really was so decadent, and it matched the watch itself, which is maybe the most decadent watch I've ever imagined. It's a pretty decadent brand, and it's hard to imagine until you actually meet a collector who is the customer for that watch, because it's just it requires a lot to imagine who might be comfortable wearing something so big, so expensive, so crazy looking.
Sure.
And yet I met one, and he he had a ton of other watches across all different brands, and he just loved the conversation that these pieces start. He just loved it. And there were quite a few collectors there. So I
Interesting.
how many do they have to sell to pay for that? Not that many, really, right?
Yeah.
It's an expensive watch. If they can sell a few, they're probably in good standing. So,
This is this. I find it fascinating. Jacob and Co. sort of coming back, and it ties into one of the perennial conversations Andy and I have been having pretty much with every guest, either consciously or subconsciously, for the last half of 2022, which is talking about the return of Frank Mueller.
oh,
I started my sort of speaking to Frank Mueller was my first proper interview as a sort of watch writer. And for so much of my career, they'd sort of been a brand on the outs, like they weren't as
Mm.
cool as they were in the
They'd
early
peak already.
2000s.
yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe I'm sort of manifesting it, but I'm seeing lots of people talking about Frank Mueller. I'm seeing some cool collaborations and sort of. Are they on a return, arc? Are we gonna be writing about master bankers again in this year? Is it?
I mean,
Are
I
they back, Victoria?
that's a that's a great point. I remember Frank Mueller from my sort of, the first 5 or 6 years of me going to Switzerland. And I remember going to those parties at Watchland. Have either of you been to Watchland, his estate on the
I've
outskirts of?
No,
I've I've managed. I haven't been able to make it. I'm sorry.
I
I've not
haven't
been
for
invited.
years, let me
So
tell you. This was like in the past, but those
Sure.
parties were so much fun because you would just show up, and there'd be just this crazy atmosphere and lots of champagne and food. And again, talking about decadence. He was, I don't know what year you might say Frank Mueller kind of had his peak, and then when things, I think it was, business dealings and sort of falling outs with various business partners that might have set the brand on a path to sort of falling out of favor. But I think this whole neo vintage movement is got to be part of that. He was one of the earliest. I don't think we really even thought about him as an independent watchmaker, but he certainly predates all
Mm,
the current generation, him and Roger Dubuis,
yeah,
and, a handful, Vianney Halter, that were around in the 90s doing, FP Jordan was clearly around, but not till the end of that decade did he start making a splash. So I think this whole obsession with the neo vintage movement, pieces from the 90s by this early class of independence. I think it surely is a moment, and if he's going to seize any moment to come back, why not now? I don't know that much about where his business is at in terms of like the structure of the business, and all the complicated things that they don't tell you, like debts and so on. So, but in terms of a moment, I do think it does seem right that we might be seeing a return of that brand.
Well, I wonder what collaboration it would take, like, because everyone's collaborating. That's sort of when things get a little bit choppy, people come together and hedge their risk with a solid collaboration. I wonder what collaboration it would take to really put Frank Miller back.
Jay-Z.
God, that'd be
John Mayer,
amazing.
probably. John Mayer.
Jay-Z back on.
John Mayer. I mean, these are great questions. I just like I need a minute to like stew on Frank Mueller. I mean, he probably knows quite a bit of people. He's like, I've met him once or twice, and he's a
Yeah.
really charismatic guy. He's like handsome and confident, and
He's not
it,
involved anymore, I don't think. I think
which is
he's,
such a shame because he's
well,
so
I mean, maybe
cool.
not for him. Maybe he's just living his best life,
Maybe, yeah. I mean, fair enough. And
I mean, he's done his hard yards.
Yeah.
If I was him, I'd quite happily retire and, hang out in
so
the south of France.
who runs that brand? Is it his old
It's a mystery.
No, what's his name? Oh, I know his name. He's a
Is
Nicholas or
he
something. He's a Swiss guy. He's
okay?
The
Well,
Swiss.
find out. I
Swiss
mean,
Nick.
you have the resources of the New York Times at your beck and call.
Yeah.
oh,
You
surely,
could give
surely
the
I could.
investigative report.
I should just go travel to Watchland and have some champagne and see
I think
what
it's
comes.
rosé. It's
It's
rosé.
A lot of
rosé all
rosé.
day.
Rosé, like, yeah, that's the motto. Okay, so you're obviously an expert in jewelry as well. So I got a two-part question. Which watch brands make the best jewelry, and which jewelry brands make the best watches?
Oh, that's a good question,
That
Andy.
is a good question.
Thank
I
you.
mean, Cartier,
And
full
Cartier.
stop. You can't think about jewelry. I mean, it's a jeweler. Cartier was a jeweler before it was a watchmaker, and to see their high jewelry workshop or their high sort of horology workshop where they're putting together some of these like panther timepieces that are just paved entirely. I mean, they're incredible. Their jewelry expertise is, they're at the top of their game. So Cartier for sure. Chopard does some really lovely, lovely jewels, really high end jewelry. It's again that family business where Caroline Schauffele runs the jewelry side, and her brother Carl Friedrich Schauffele runs the watch side, and that's a tremendous. I mean, they do really well in terms of feeding each other. Piaget makes incredible, incredible jewelry
Mm,
watches, and really, stellar watchmaking. I mean, when you talk about thinness and everything that this whole race to be the thinnest. I mean, Piaget was really at the top of that for many years and has a great history. Maybe isn't making the headlines. Well, I mean, their Altiplano, I think, was until Bulgari and Richard Mille stepped into the thinness game, was certainly the model to beat. But yeah, Piaget makes tremendous jewelry and really, really beautiful jewelry watches, actually. So I'd say Cartier, Piaget. I mean, Van Cleef. My God, now that you start, it's hard to actually stop thinking about all the different brands that occupy both spaces, even
yeah.
though the industries themselves are really different. I mean, they're sold through many of the same channels,
Mm.
and many of the same brands occupy both worlds or straddle both worlds. But the business of jewelry and the business of watches, they're very, very different.
Why? What do you mean?
Well, jewelry is a lot more family run. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
much more fragmented industry. So you have tons more small regional family businesses around the world that operate in jewelry, and it's much less branded. You can buy generic jewelry. I mean, that's pretty much what most people buy and what most people know. The branded sector of that market is small, growing leaps and bounds, but still quite small. But the opposite is true in watches. You don't buy generic watches. It is
Mm,
a branded business. It's a corporate business. You've got your niche independents, but for the most part, most watches are produced by big groups or groups that are, publicly owned. So, and the way they do, and, the way they source is different. I mean, sure, you use a lot of precious materials in some watch companies, but in
Mm.
jewelry, it's all, gemstones and gold and platinum, and those those sourcing channels are a lot more opaque than, buying a ton of steel. And not that I don't know that any watch brand's using, I don't know how many tons of steel watch brands use, but you know, you, you're sourcing different goods through different channels, much smaller businesses in the jewelry end. You're dealing with, in some cases, miners who are artisanal, that are mining sapphire when they're not farming, and those sapphires
Yep.
end up in the global marketplace. It's actually a harder business to trace. I mean, watches are
Yeah.
pretty easy in some ways, but when you're talking about traceability and that kind of transparency that's so that people are demanding these days, it's much, much harder in jewelry.
Talking about traceability, I want to ask you about that in a second. But before that, I think something that I'm keen to get your take on, because I'm hearing more and more about it on the watch side, and I suspect you've been having the conversation for a lot longer. Lab-grown diamonds. I
Yes.
remember having a conversation with someone that worked at a big sort of one of the those jewelry watch houses, and I said, "What do you think? Are you ever going to do this sort of stuff?" And he's like, "No, it's not it's not going to change anything. It's marketing." Is that what you think about it, or is it somewhat more complicated?
It's more complicated, and it really depends on where you're coming in from, but it is, I've been to lab grown factories. I've been I've, had a lot of conversations with De Beers around this. I mean, lab grown, first of all, it's a hard market for luxury companies to embrace and understand, because so much of it is the prices are going down. I mean, there's just a lot of production from around the world. It's a commodity, and you can't, it's not like a big giant pink diamond from Argyle that is scarce and getting scarcer, and there's going to be value in that diamond, in some investment potential. I mean, lab grown is the exact opposite. You buy it for, I don't know, 1,000 today, and who knows, it might be worth, a few bucks in a few years,
Mm,
because just there's no scarcity there. You can just manufacture at will. So it's a hard market for luxury brands to get involved with, but not impossible. And some are trying. I mean, I think what Tag Heuer did, if you remember, they put out a
yep,
watch, the Carrera Plasma. Um, I forget what it was called, but exactly.
it's a
But it
It's
was
just the
long
this,
plasma.
name.
yeah, it had a long name, but it had what they did, and they very purposefully described it as, it wasn't a watch that tried to position itself as something that was environmentally better, because that is an argument that a lot of lab grown producers have made, is, hey, we're the eco choice. And yet, there, it's sort of dubious. I mean, we don't know, did you come from a Chinese factory, a Russian factory? um, how much energy did it take to produce these lab grown diamonds? I mean, it's sort of a facile argument to make, unless you're really standing there and providing all the emissions, and really documenting the source of these stones, which most companies are not. So I don't buy the eco argument for lab grown, but
Mm.
Tag Heuer didn't make that point, and it made clear it wasn't making that point. The point it made was, we're using lab grown because they allow us to create crazy cuts and do things we simply could not
Yep.
do in natural diamonds. We simply could not take a single natural rough diamond, cut it into a giant crown, and have that be our, the beautiful sort of showpiece of our watch. I mean, you just can't do stuff like that natural, because the rough doesn't either grow that big, or it's just prohibitively expensive. You could
Yeah,
not do
exactly.
that.
Mm. Yeah, getting
So,
a
yeah.
dial's worth of a single piece of diamond would be ridiculous.
Right. And so I think that was a really interesting take. It's like the lab grown allows us to be creative in a way we couldn't be with natural. So that's why we're using it. And that's a really interesting case.
Yeah, and I think that's what I took. That was my takeaway from it as well. Like, I would 100% buy a watch with a lab grown diamond dial, because I'm not going to be able to afford a fully pave dial, and I like the look. Like,
I think a lot of like younger, someone who's 31, a lot of people my age, which is a couple of years younger than you, Felix, and maybe you, Victoria, is there's a bit of a coolness attached to lab grown diamonds now. Like, people are sort of saying
Mm.
it's cool, it's interesting. Like, there's the tech side of it, and as you've kind of said, it can achieve different things, and I guess it's a bit less traditional, but that seems to be a lot of things. electric cars and all that sort of stuff as well, that there's actually something really positive about it, and it's not necessarily sustainable. It's that, well, it's cheaper, but it's cool. Like, I actually don't think there's anything wrong with it. I find the whole tech thing cool, and it looks the same, and if no one can tell us the difference, big deal. Is that something you've noticed in the industry?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think, especially if you're talking to young people who work in technology or
Mm,
yeah, there's just a natural kind of comfort level with that kind of product. I do think there's a lot more consumer interest, awareness. I mean, I've had people reaching out to me fairly often asking me if I
mm.
can help direct them to buy an engagement ring. And often it is like, we just want a big stone and we're
Yeah,
willing to go with a lab grown because it's going to
Sure.
allow us that.
Yep.
Excuse me. So yeah,
interesting.
I think they're here to stay. I mean, where the market sort of ends up at, or what the rightful place, we're probably still working through that. But there's no doubt. I mean, it's not
Hmm.
going anywhere.
Interesting. Last, well, it's another nerdy question for you. It's a Moser, H Moser that came out pretty recently. 3D printed QR code case vibes. I know you wrote it up and had
Yeah.
a bit of a look at it. What's your take on that watch?
Thank you for asking. I love H Moser. They are
Mm,
clearly they are. They don't shy away from tackling controversial topics, provocative topics. I really applaud them because they've gone places and they've gotten pushback and they've had
mm,
to deal with, in some cases, when they comment on Swiss made or they comment on brands in the industry or any of these any of these topics they tackle. So I applaud them and I'm not surprised that of all the different brands out there that they went out and made a watch that's, and introduced it in the metaverse. I think it's cool and I'm glad they're trying. I'm not sold on that digital
yep.
immersive experience. I'm just not sold on it. I feel like I kept asking myself when I was listening and I was an avatar in that lounge, in the metaverse
Well
lounge they
done.
set up.
Yep.
And I kept thinking, would this be easier or better or any different if we were just sitting on a Zoom call or a regular old webinar? And I thought, no, like what value is this metaverse adding except that I'm just fuddling around trying to figure out how to point my avatar so I'm not like running into a wall. It just felt like gimmicky.
Mm. And who's it for? And it's a bit of a, what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, I read a really interesting op-ed by I think it was Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, who was talking about how the whole Bitcoin and crypto bubble, it it just doesn't really make sense. And the actually, it wasn't even so much crypto; it was more about blockchain. And
Mm,
there was so much, obviously, attention paid to blockchain technology and all these people getting on board. But in the end, what people haven't talked about is just how it hasn't really worked for them, or it doesn't. There's the use case isn't there. There's not really a value for it, other than I guess this gimmicky way to talk about something new. We've yet to see, but I'm not sold. It may be that I'm a Gen Xer. I born in '73, turning 50 next year, or turning 50 this year. Maybe I'm not the audience for it, but I've yet to figure out why I would like want to spend more time on my phone.
My take here, I always look at these things, and I guess you have to try it, but I have the sneaking suspicion that I don't know. When I grew up, there were always those daggy TV shows about what life was like in the '80s, or what life was like in the. We're gonna have that in 50 years' time, and it's like that wacky moment in the 2020s when QR codes were on everything.
yeah, that crazy, yeah, the
It's
crazy watch.
it's kind of it's going to be the commercial experience equivalent of Justin Bieber wearing not Justin Bieber, Justin the other one, Timberland, wearing double denim in the 2003 Olympics.
Love it. I mean,
It's
I
that.
like you got to try this stuff. You don't know what works until you try it and it doesn't work. So I really love the experimentation. So and I'm sure some people will buy it just because they have enough money and they don't mind having a QR code engraved on the sapphire crystal of their very expensive mechanical watch. But in the end, like even Gen Z, you talk to Gen Zers and they're like, we spend so much time on our phones. We don't want to spend more time on our phones. I want to be back to, real analog. I don't know. I'm a lover of analog.
Before we leave, I know we've talked about it a little bit, but I know I'm originally sort of wanted to speak to you about it more, but the conversation went in different ways. Sustainability. I think that's sort of the big thread that's been undercurrenting a lot of what's been happening narratively or marketingly in
Hmm.
watches over the last year or so. I've read some of your sort of incredible pieces that goes a little bit deeper into what that means and what that looks like. What's happening? Like, how are we at a place where watch brands buying their own secondary market, you know, sales platforms
Yeah.
are being branded the circular economy? What's really going on with this big sort of sustainability push?
I mean, like the first wave of it was, and this was maybe close to a decade ago, solar panels on our roofs, and we're
Mm.
encouraging everybody to bike. And those watch brands still talk about that. And I can't help but kind of roll my eyes a bit because it sounds lovely. And of course, it's important. But what's actually moving the needle in terms of the way these companies market and produce their watches. I mean, so much of it is just stop flying business class, stop flying people everywhere. And that's a conversation that I don't think the industry is ready to have or actually, do anything
Wants to
about.
have.
Cause yeah, I mean, I think I'll never forget this because it was about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And I did a question, sort of a piece for the Times about how can the watch industry be greener? And I went out to all these different people. And of course they're talking about, using sort of eco sustainable materials for their straps and or vegan kind of straps or mushroom leather or whatever, or they're talking about the solar panels on the roofs. And then I ended up interviewing an industrial ecologist from Yale who had nothing to do with the watch industry but does study the science of environmentalism. And when a company makes a claim about how many emissions it's saved, his team goes out and kind of researches that stuff. And I said, well, what can they do? And he's like, stop flying business class. Because when you fly business class, you take up seats that could be used to fly more people, and the more seats or the more people you displace, the more planes you'll need. And that's what drives the needle in terms of savings of emissions or so on, and sustainability. A lot of watch companies, they just don't use they're not using the amount of steel that a car industry is using
Mm,
or the construction industry is using. I mean, they're making watches, so it's good in the sense that they're promoting these concepts to a wealthy, affluent audience who then might actually have the ability to make changes at the companies they run. But in terms of the actual industry, I mean, I think so much of it is just we don't want to stop having our big fancy events and flying people business class all over the world. And I consider myself in that. I have to ask, like, if somebody invites me on a business trip and offers to fly me business class, could I say no? And it's very
Mm.
hard. It's very hard to look after
mm,
the collective good at the expense of your own personal comfort level. But we should be.
yeah.
Wise words.
Mm.
Wise words.
So
Yeah.
we're another one, and again, crystal ball gazing. Who, and as an insider in the certainly the American part of the watch industry, but also more broadly, where it's the start of a new year. We're full of hope. Watches and Wonders is just around the corner. Hopefully, we'll see you there. Who's going to have a good year? Do you think this year? Who's going to sort of um, come out of the gate really strong and dazzle us with their releases?
That's a great question too. I think the indies in general
Mm.
will have a very good year. We've talked about it a couple times, the Debethunes, the FP Journes, the Groenfelds, those small batch makers where scarcity is just an inherent part of their business model. They just don't have the capacity to produce more. Rolex will always have a good year.
Mm.
I think Rolex, it occupies its own planet, and then there's planet watchmaking. So there's two
Mm,
planets. One of them is planet Rolex, the other is planet watchmaking. Everybody else, so Rolex is, a phenomenon that I don't see ending anytime soon. I mean, 50 years from now. And I think that's because they look 50 years from now when they're probably thinking about their broader strategy. They don't think in any way in the short term or even the medium term. They think
I
incredibly long
think
term.
centuries.
Yeah, I mean, they think it, and it's a quirk of the way they're organized and structured. It's a foundation that runs that company. So Rolex will always have a good year. A lot of the indies will have a good year. Trying to, I think Jaeger LeCoultre has a few things cooking in terms of some heritage projects in the works.
Okay.
I think that's a brand that, I've always been a huge fan of the Reverso, but there's clearly so much there in their archives. I mean, they are the watchmaker to the watchmakers. So Jaeger-LeCoultre's a brand that probably is, maybe hasn't had its proper due and is deserving of that. A lot of people talk about Lange, in terms of secondary market, does
Sure.
not have the kind of hoopla around the big four, the Audemars and the Richard Milles and the Rolexes and Pateks, but Lange certainly has the chops to be in that cohort.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I think
This
those
could go
are a
on.
few.
It's the same faces, broadly speaking. I think, JLC is an interesting
Chelsea,
one.
yeah.
That's
And also, we recently went through your 2022 predictions
Oh,
list, and we reflected on it. So we'll do that next year with you.
my
We'll hold you
goodness.
accountable.
Please hold me accountable.
Because
I think you did pretty well. I think
You did, yeah.
It was an old Robb Report. No, Watch Pro or Robb Report? Watch Pro.
Well, no, Robb Report.
it
Yeah.
was Robb Report, yeah,
Okay.
with about half a dozen different sort of industry people sort of giving their predictions, and they were about half right. They were about half
Right.
right. So
Well,
But we
maybe
did-
that's just statistical. But you know what? I'm about to put by the time people are listening to this, the 23 predictions piece for Robb Report will be out.
we'll link it up.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's
Put
as
me down for Frank Mueller's coming back.
I'd love to actually wish I had talked to somebody about that, because I do think you're onto something there.
Well, it's not too late. Or is it? Who knows? With when we're recording this and when we're publishing it, Victoria. The last question we ask our guests is for recommendation. Nothing watch related. Just something you've been enjoying. Something you think that the people listening wherever they are in the car at home would also benefit from checking out. So it could be a podcast, a book.
Could be White Lotus.
White Lotus has been recommended. So something that's not White Lotus.
I'll do two recommendations. I love the Ezra Klein podcast on the New York Times.
Okay.
He interviews people across all genres and specialties, but there's a strong bent towards futuristic topics. So if you just want big thinkers talking about everything from AI to, just policy changes, the war in Ukraine, go to Ezra Klein. And then the second recommendation is actually the product of an Australian named Richard Christensen. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He lives in LA. He did advertising in New York for a couple of years. He's from a farm somewhere. I'm not even sure what state in Australia, but he has a brand called Flamingo Estate.
Okay.
And he is just a fascinating guy who seems to know everybody, and they create such beautiful products. He literally lives on a farm in the Highland Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. And if you are local enough to it, you can get produce delivered from the farm, every Friday. If you're not local, you can order their beautiful honeys and olive oils and rosés and soaps and candles. And it's just a really brilliant marketing job. And I yearn to be invited to a dinner at Richard Christensen's estate here in LA. So check out that. I think it's really cool. And he talks about his childhood in Australia quite a bit. So
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look now.
New South Wales, Duranbah. Pretty rural, I should say.
Is he a real farmer, or is he like a R.M. Williams farmer?
Well,
Concrete cowboy. I think he's legit. I think he's legit.
yeah, I think his parents he grew up in that environment. So
There'd be nothing else to do in northern New South Wales other than.
It's the political heartland of.
Apparently, Oprah's also a fan, so you're in good company.
I'm in good company, no doubt.
Yeah.
We'll find someone that knows him. We'll get you an invite.
Thank you, please.
We'll get you. Yeah,
23.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us, Victoria.
Thank you guys so much, Andy and Felix. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the thoughtful and really interesting questions.
We did it.
It's done.
Andy, really great to finally get Victoria Gomelsky on the podcast. Thanks to Asha, of course, for pushing us over the edge and sending her email address. Really appreciate that. Thanks also to Artem Straps for their ongoing support, second year running. And thanks to you, Andy, for suggesting top quality TV shows.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'll be back next week.
We should be. OT the podcast at gmail.com, ot.podcast, Instagram. Subscribe. If there's some sort of podcast platform, maybe, you YouTube. We need more subscribers there. Get on that.
Yeah, I mean, join our Discord, leave some comments in our channels. So hot takes are always welcome. In fact, they're encouraged.
I see in there at the moment.
I know it's getting a bit. Well, we won't. No spoilers. You have to join to find out for yourself. All right, we'll see you next week, guys.